There is a saying where I live, Merv has an opinion on everything, don't get him started. It is true. We all have our secret sins, just that some of them are not so secret. Anyway, here's another opinion, so let's get started. In some post recently and in a video or two, I have hinted that God will bring all his creation home to himself. It's often termed the ultimate reconciliation, or the restoration of all things. It's a belief that God will not let sin and death do more than 3/4 of his human creation to eternal fire, but in his love and redemptive power restore all humanity. Or as the Scottish theologian George MacDonald puts it, all nations will worship God as the source of righteousness and strength, and divine love will triumph in all. What about the hell text, you ask? Because mostly people ask that. That's if they haven't turned away in disgust. Yeah, the hell texts, lots of them. They put the wind up us, don't they? You know, I once listened to a debate on this topic. They had the texts, two of the smartest brains in the business, and in more than an hour, verse after verse, they were no closer to any sense of agreement than they were at the beginning. So if they can't reach anything like agreement, knowing all the stuff that they know, I don't think we will either. So let's not go there. Anyway, I said this is an opinion, not fact. So you have to cut me a little slack. I came to this opinion in stages. I remember in the early 80s when a colleague posed a rhetorical question. There was a dreadful famine in Africa, Biafra I think at the time. And he said, what about this young woman that's never known Jesus? She's just had a life of abuse and starvation and horror. And then she dies young. She goes to hell, right? No, not right. No amount of wrangling text could ever make that right. And the God is love but is also just line will not cut it. There has to be part of the grand narrative that people of the book have to read, like reading the inspired writings of those regarded as heretics. I often wondered why George MacDonald was kicked out of the church. And then when I read his views on universal reconciliation, I knew why. No wonder he had to go. Does that make his views wrong? When I first read them, something shifted in my thinking. There was a sense of resolution in thinking about that poor African woman and millions like her, and an embracing of the profound truth in God's intent, not willing that any should perish. This shift in thinking was furthered by the variety and the calibre of theologians who believe, as MacDonald did, that hell is restorative, not final nor punitive. The view of hell, or Sheol, that was held by the Jews in Jesus' time, it was a nebulous state. It was neither reward nor punishment, and a place where resurrection was possible. This view was held by the early church, but by the 4th and 5th centuries, after those various councils, hell was well and truly in place, and it's been in place ever since. Because the fear of hell is a great motivator for conversion. And perhaps as the church has developed such an us and them mentality, it allows a place for the thems. I mean, they've rejected God, so God rejects them, so we can too. That's not my opinion of God. Understanding God and his grand narratives comes from more than reading. We need to see what is written on the landscape, in nature, inscribed in history, and especially that revealed in those heady moments of contemplation. For me, those revelations happen when I travel. Like the final stage, or when all the pieces of this puzzle came into a beautiful, coherent whole. This happened at El Morro National Monument in New Mexico. In 1698, the Spaniards, after conquering all of Mexico, they were on their search for these fabled cities of gold, and they took with them Franciscan priests, for in their view, this land was a harvest ready for the sickle, a harvest of souls. And when I contemplated the museum displays, I found myself asking, they had the choice, baptism or the sword. What sort of a conversion was that? Well, it turned out to be not much of a conversion, because they weren't very good Catholics. So instead of the sickle, they got the sword. It was disturbing to read that text, and it brought it all to a head for me. The Franciscans tried to protect their confused, unconvinced and unconverted flock, but they failed. The Pueblo people were massacred. Then something better than a text, a voice. They are my children and I have taken them home. Don't ask me where it came from, for I don't know. All I know is God has them covered, for it is his divine intent to bring all men home to himself. Then it struck me, MacDonald's view, like that of the early church fathers, was not just an attractive theological position, it has application in people's lives, then and now. The idea of restoration of all things shifted from my head to my heart, where it has stayed ever since. Now I embrace a God who in his very essence is love, one who can bring redemption out of the horrors of how men can treat each other. Redemption and restoration, not judgment and punishment. We are, after all, his creation, created for relationship as children with the Father. Divine love in triumph over sin and death. I remember as our travels continued, looking at the Ground Zero Memorial in New York, the rows and rows of crosses at Gettysburg, the Trail of Tears memorials, and even where Robin's great-grandfather came from, in the Isle of Mull in Scotland. That was a training base during the war, escort crews, and many of them were among the more than 80,000 Allied seamen lost at sea. And instead of a sense of despair, I had a deep gratitude for an understanding of a God who has it covered, bringing his children home to himself. I've lost friends and many arguments for holding these views, but I have won something worthwhile, the capacity to discard the us and them attitude and replace it with a new humility. Where once I had intense feelings of hostility towards Muslims, for example, I now see them as part of the every knee shall bow scenario. The most strident, in-your-face, fanatical jihadist, overwhelmed by the glory and the majesty of the presence of God himself, seeing for the first time both the way that they'd misrepresented God and the true beauty of divine love. For the first time in my life, I can see what sort of view of God is necessary for the Jew, instead of counting the steps under the burden of the Roman soldier's pack, and then after about 2,000 throwing it down in the dust, saying instead, I'm happy to go another mile with you. Or, for the first time in my life, seeing how Jesus' extraordinary injunction to love your enemies could possibly be fulfilled. It's a theology that embraces all people as part of God's creation, one that presents the Father and family in relationship, despite many being unaware of it. A relationship, moreover, that views judgment as restorative, not punitive. This changes everything. And it is a theology that disallows one member of the family saying they're better than another, or to exclude anyone. Yeah, I have an opinion on everything. They're all up for changing if more information comes available, but that one is not. God's ultimate restoration of all is not for changing. That one's a keeper.